Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Baseball, college football, the drug culture, and tax reform. Are these things connected? We have some panelists here today on Public Affairs Roundtable who will try to make that connection. Those panelists are Ball State University professors John Rouse from political science, commenting on the inherent contradictions of college and athletics. Steve Johnson from sociology, talking about the new baseball and the newly revealed connection to the drug culture. And Cecil Bohannon from economics, who will talk to us about tax reform. Cecil, why don't you go first? Well, in this loose connection, is tax reform something whose time will not come?
Well, it's interesting. Political analysts are saying at this point there's so many other things that are pressing the congressional agenda that tax reform is not very likely this year. And I think that's probably the case. Nevertheless, I think its time eventually will come. Eventually, there will be some political payoff to reforming the tax system.
We've been talking about it forever.
I know.
And it's been a great topic this year. I mean, it's on the cover of the news magazines. It's the topic of conversation in a non-political year. Tax reform is something people want. There's a hue and cry, or is there?
Well, it's not so much that the people want tax reform. It's if you ask them if they want tax reform, sure. I mean, if you ask someone if they want a Jaguar, sure, they'd like to have a Jaguar. The question is, are they really willing to do anything about it? Probably not. I think there's a good reason. What we're talking about is tax restructuring. Notice that everything the Reagan administration has talked about in terms of tax reform has to do with not so much lowering the tax burden that the average citizen pays, as much as it is restructuring that tax burden. Now, there's good economic reasons for doing that. There's good economic reasons for doing that. For an example, we're talking about lowering the corporate tax rate, but eliminating some corporate deductions, such as the deduction that allows major companies to buy box seats at a baseball game and deduct that. What we're talking about in terms of the individual income tax is doing things like taking away certain deductions, but in turn giving people lower marginal tax rates. Now, in the long run, that would be very healthy for the economy. For the average citizen, however, what it would generate would be a lower direct tax bill, but the loss of some deductions. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The average citizen is not going to end up ahead or behind by virtue of that, at least of the first round. So he doesn't care. He's not going to rise congressman and get all hot and bothered about some tax reform proposal that in the final analysis leaves his tax bill the same and simply has to do with restructuring of the incentives. He's not going to care about that. And that's why it is that even though Reagan's huffing and puffing and trying to get tax reform off the ground, I don't think it's going to work because I don't think the average citizen sees any direct benefit to him personally.
Cecil, aren't you saying in a way that, and of course I know that you're kind of a supply and demand kind of person, basically you're saying that there is no political demand for this kind of change?
That's right. Okay. That's right. Because it's an abstract change that most people don't understand. The whole purpose of tax reform is to do the following. It's to lower what we call marginal tax rates. That is, lower the tax rate that you earn on an extra increment of income. Now, in order to enhance revenue, to make that kind of tax reform revenue neutral, what you have to do is close up some loopholes. Now, if you ask the average man in the street, you pay $5,000 a year in taxes, now we're going to rearrange the tax structure, you're still going to pay $5,000 a year in taxes, which is on average what has to happen. He's not going to be that excited about that. He'll say, yeah, either way I pay $5,000.
Yeah, it isn't Reagan's main thrust with this, so this is going to simplify things. It's going to make the tax system more understandable to the average American public. But it seems to me every time you restructure things, somebody's going to get hurt, somebody's going to start yelling, says, well, don't take it from the other guy, not from me. Isn't that the main problem here?
It's incredible how under the guise of tax simplicity as a slogan, you can end up making the tax code more complex than it ever was before. For exactly the reason you pointed out, that every time you start taking away one deduction, a special interest group cries, and then what happens is, well, you rearrange it to take away other deductions, or you restructure the deductions to make them maybe not as profound as they were before, but nevertheless still there. So what we're going to end up with is, under the guise of tax simplification, probably having a more complex code. I mean, I think tax simplification is a real misnomer. What we're really looking for is a restructuring of the tax code, and I think the basic thrust of it's good. But the political problems and the political support for that, I think, is going to be very difficult to to generate.
Now, who's going to get hurt by this? I mean, who is likely to get hurt by tax reform? Somebody's going to pay for it.
Yeah, well, I think the industries, if you look at it, part of it's going to be a restructuring away from individuals to the corporate sector, which you can argue is that's not a very good way to restructure taxes, and I think there's some good points to be made there. I think one of the reasons it gets restructured to the corporate sector is nobody knows who pays corporate income taxes anyway. There's a perception that when business pays taxes that no one pays the tax, so that at least makes it more politically palatable. But I think, and this is very important for the state of Indiana, what you'd have is a tax code that is less favorable to capital-intensive industries. Currently, one of the things they're talking about phasing out with the tax reform proposal are things like the investment tax credit, things that have specifically helped the big-ticket industries like steel, like automobiles, that tend to use a lot of capital relative to labor. And in that sense, that could be something that wouldn't be very helpful in Indiana, especially the northern part of the state, or in auto country either. That could certainly hurt the ability of General Motors and Chrysler to add to the capital stock, which of course would be the basis of jobs, particularly in this area.
And is the individual taxpayer likely to see some direct benefit out of this? I mean, 81 there was a lot of support for a tax cut plan.
Yeah.
When you're talking about tax cut,
yeah, that's
you've got
right.
support,
I mean, that's what I think, Larry. I think that generally the politics of tax cutting is a lot easier than the politics of tax reforming. Most people are legitimately suspicious of any tinkering of the tax system, especially when we start talking about taking away certain deductions. I mean, if I look at my state and local income tax deductibility, my property tax deductibility, that's one of the primary things that's going to be eliminated. That's worth something to me if I'm a homeowner. And weighing that out compared to the lowering of marginal tax rates, on average, my suspicion is that most people would project that they end up being about the same. Or there'd be a fear that they'd be worse off, and I think that people are suspicious of politicians, quite rightfully so.
If I could follow up with a question, what are some particulars in terms of the impact of this tax reform proposal upon Hoosiers in the Indiana situation?
Well, again, as I said before, I think this would tend to hurt capital-intensive industries that would be Indiana-related. Now, on the other hand, perhaps the growth in the state of Indiana will be in the service sector like it is being everywhere else. Service sector industries, I think, would do better under the way the particular corporate tax is planning to be restructured. Otherwise, in the state of Indiana, they'd be essentially the same effects that would be everywhere else for individuals.
Well, let me ask a couple of questions. We know, for example, that the state and local taxes are fairly low here. Is not the focus of the Reagan proposal to do away with that part as a deduction, and wouldn't that have, as you said a few minutes ago, and a negative impact, for example, upon education?
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. That somehow slipped my mind. Of course, there is that impact on local government. To the extent state and local taxes are no longer deductible, that obviously makes it more difficult for state and localities to raise funds.
But it affects Indiana a lot less than, let's say, New York.
Yeah, that's right.
The taxes
that's
are much
right.
higher.
That's right. Which means, in a relative sense, I suppose that would be helpful for our public sector.
I got one question, though, Cecil. Are they ever going to get rid of the 3-martini lunch?
I don't know. They've been talking about that for years.
Yes.
Or, deductions that business corporations get for taking people to baseball games and football games, which is a nice one if you know someone in a big corporation gets to do that for you. I don't know. I mean, it's amazing how these things manage to wiggle their way back in. I mean, every Democratic, and for a matter of fact, every Republican president or every head of any tax reform committee has always talked about getting rid of the 3-martini lunch, and yet it's always there.
What does tax
I'd prefer something besides martinis.
What does tax reform, John Rouse, have to do with college athletics, with higher education? You make the connection.
Okay, well, as I give a donation to the Cardinal Varsity Club, I can take that off on my taxes, and I get a tax break. And perhaps if the proposal goes through, I will not be able to do that. So, but I think the reason that I thought this was a kind of interesting issue at this time in September, of course, is that the college football season is coming upon us, and there's a great deal of economic emphasis upon college football and college athletics, and I think it's very important for us to take a look at this as we go through this season. I think the first thing that I want to try to emphasize is that the focus of college athletics in this country, or the focus upon college and the intellectual pursuit, is different than it is in, say, England or Europe. And I would say that there are 3 kinds of things we could look at. First of all, economic institutions educational institutions or economic institutions. They hire people, they pay salaries, and in terms of Ball State University, if you would cut the enrollment from 17,000 to 1,000, by 1,000 to say 16,000 or 15,000, that would have a negative impact upon this community in terms of buying power and that kind of thing. A second focus in terms of a state university, I think, is upon culture and community. And that's where you have things like sports. I sort of call the Ball State team the East Central Indiana semi-professional football Cardinals.
Well, they're much better than the Colts, maybe.
Well, perhaps so. So also, if you look at the cultural or community aspect emphasis, you could also bring in Emmons Auditorium and the focus upon the series of plays that we have here. So I would say that number two, a university has a cultural kind of focus. So economic, cultural, and also academic. Now, I would also distinguish the academic as being separate in this kind of way. People get frustrated oftentimes by when athletics gets a bigger play than does academics. I would say that American institutions, educational institutions, are economic in this way, and they also have a focus upon the academics. The thing I'm trying to say is that it's not the old intellectual pursuit. Basically, educational institutions focus as much upon the professional schools as well as the academic, traditional liberal arts kinds of concerns. So that's my third focus.
Well, is what you're saying, John, is that even though ostensibly Ball State University is supposed to be a nonprofit institution, and although we all have this image of a university as being the ivory tower where scholars think deep thoughts and impart wisdom upon the younger generation, is it? No, let's face it, college universities have to make money. They have to balance budgets, which means they have to pursue margins that aren't within the confines of what would make an Oxford Don happy.
Yeah, I think the question we could look at is how many communists do we have on the faculty at Ball State University?
Well,
to
my
have a
perspective,
communist on the faculty at Ball State University, that is just not in the economic picture of East Central Indiana, or the cultural perspective, or the community perspective, economic, culture, and academic. It'd be very difficult for a true red communist to exist here.
Or let's look at it another way. Let's suppose we required all students to take medieval Latin and ancient Greek in order to get any degree.
Yeah.
How long do you think Ball State would last? Every accounting major has to be proficient in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek.
Or even less
before
than
he
that in
gets
a
out.
sense, Spanish or German.
Oh, yeah, right.
Or
Even some
French.
reasonable language.
Yeah,
right.
something reasonable.
Right.
Let me just pose this, though. Isn't the athletic budget somewhat independent, though, of the academic budget? I mean, doesn't the fruits that come from athletic competition, having a good team and what have you, isn't that pretty much pumped back into the athletic program? It really doesn't benefit the academic side in a college to have necessarily a good football team or basketball team, other than the sense that it might draw students, to the university, because.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that the trend in terms of the economic thing is pretty difficult to tie together. For example, what if college football, for example, does not benefit the college student here at Ball State? Why have it? I mean, supposedly having these athletics, and of course the budget here at Ball State is over $1 million for athletics, and you may think that's high, but that's low. I mean, Ball State's budget is something like 9 or 10 in the Mid-American Conference in terms of how high it is, but it's extremely low in terms of the Big Ten schools. So you have that uncertain relationship between how much is put in athletics and how does it pay off in a social kind of sense.
But if Ball State has the best football team in the nation, or Ball State has one of the best basketball teams in the nation, and you start getting contracts from ABC and NBC to show your games, your budget goes up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, Ball State is not here because of in its position being low in an athletic budget because of a philosophical difference with other universities. It's there because right now it's not a Division I-A winner, top 10 in the nation.
Certainly.
Also, when you get a good athletic program, that tends to possibly dominate the academic side. Like, for example, it's more important, let's say, at the University of Missouri than Ball State to have a good football team. So if students let's say, on the football team aren't doing very well in class, there might be more pressure on faculty to try to get them by. There might be some kinds of more subtle pressures than that, possibly. Whereas at Ball State, we're not big time, And so we probably don't have that kind of pressure on the academic side from having a successful basketball and football team.
Well, I think all of this is based upon culture, or what is accepted. And Ball State is in the game of trying to compete with Indiana University and Purdue or Indiana State, for example. And of course, you have sunk costs. One sunk cost we have here at Ball State is the football stadium, the fact that we have only one side of the football stadium, basically. But once you put all that money into sunk costs like athletics or academics or any kind of academic program, how do you deal with that kind of issue?
How do you deal with that kind of issue?
Well, I think as you look at athletics, you have to look at the total perspective. And if you cannot use athletics to benefit students, if the game is not there for the students, why have it? And and also Ball State is a regional institution which competes in the Mid-American Conference, which not only involves East Central Indiana, but also Ohio, Michigan, and so forth. And the future of Ball State is a future of Ball State in the lines of competition academically and athletically with Anderson College or Taylor University, which are small private church colleges, or is it with the Bowling Greens and the Western Michigans and the Miamis and so forth? And to answer the question, Larry, I think that's the future of this university.
Well, that's a real idealistic look at things to say that athletics, if they don't benefit the students, shouldn't exist. Of course, you see that. Tulane, the gambling scandal, point-shaving scandal, did away with the basketball program. University of San Francisco did away with the basketball program. Are we going to see more of that in higher education where, in fact, some very idealistic educators are going to say, I'm sorry, the athletic program, even if it's making money, is not to the benefit of the institution, therefore we will stress academics and we'll forget athletics for a while? Well,
I certainly hope so. And I think that athletes have to set the example. And if they do not set the example in terms of their participation academically and off the field, so to speak, they raise a very serious concern in terms of the overall focus and emphasis.
That'll take us directly into Major League Baseball. Thank you, John, for the transition.
Nice segue.
Steve Johnson, baseball, the all-American pastime. Are we looking now at hot dogs, apple pie, and cocaine? This game has changed a lot.
Indeed it has. I think it seems to be a rather interesting phenomenon that's taking place right about this time. We've got possibly one of the greatest happenings in baseball history. That is, one of the local boys, at least in terms of this part of the country, the Midwest, Pete Rose, a Cincinnati native, is about to break Ty Cobb's record for most career hits, 4,192 hits. The media's after it. It was on the cover of Time magazine about a month ago, Pete Rose was. And here we've got this rather positive image of baseball being that we see now. But at the same time, we find that in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, we find one important baseball player after another going before a judge and telling this judge and also the media that's there as well how the extent of cocaine use, at least, that takes place within the major leagues today. Keith Hernandez, who's the first baseman for the Mets, he's not a great sociologist by any means, but his estimate is about 40% of baseball players use cocaine. So here we have, I think it's kind of an interesting contrast we have at this point in time of this rather major event taking place in the form of Pete Rose breaking Ty Cobb's record for most career hits, but at the same time, the image of baseball isn't quite as good as maybe Peter Uberoff would like it to be. That is, we've got this trial taking place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in which a number of baseball players, rather prominent baseball players, by the way, saying that drug use is rather extensive, although that's still yet to be found out.
That's our culture now, though, isn't it? I mean, baseball isn't any different from anywhere else in America. And in fact, when you get a group of 20 and 21 and 22-year-old men, and you're paying them $500,000 to $1 million a year, and they work 3 or 4 or 5 months for that money, they have money available, they have time on their hands when they're not playing ball, they're going to be involved in the activities that any other 20 or 21 or 22-year-old would be involved in, or a lot of these young men would be, and that is drugs. I mean, that's no different.
Well, Mr. Peter Uberoff, the Commissioner of Baseball, would say that these men, however, have to represent an image to a number of young boys, mainly, some girls are interested as well, in baseball. They have to present an image which is an appropriate one. That's what he would say has to be done. Again, you're pointing out the realities. But still, there has to be some kind of, probably a more responsible type of person who's engaged in this kind of activity, let's say, than your average Joe Blow.
Well, this is something really different than, say, stockbrokers that work for E.F. Hutton have to put on a reasonable image. It's well known on Wall Street that a lot of stockbrokers, under a lot of pressure, do a lot of cocaine. Yet I don't think that they advertise that in the E.F. Hutton hands particularly. And it's not the kind of image E.F. Hutton would want to, or Merrill Lynch or any of the companies would particularly want to cultivate. I'm just wondering on this whole, quote, baseball scandal, whether or not this is, how much of the bad effects on baseball are really because of the media in the particular case here. Wasn't it well known that Babe Ruth liked to drink a lot of beer and did some sleazy things in his lifetime?
That's
I mean, the whole notion that baseball players have always been on a pedestal and been these wonderful role models for young people, come on, they just did a better they just had a better PR agents back then, and the press didn't tend to uncover these things.
Cecil, I think that's all perhaps true, but I got to jump in here and ask the crucial question. What does this baseball and the drug thing have to do with Indiana?
Well, there's probably a couple connections. One is that Indianapolis wants a new Major League Baseball team. And if they find out that the people involved are drug users, there won't be as much support for the development of, I think it's the Indianapolis Aeros. Probably the second connection might be with respect to the fact that Pete Rose is a Cincinnati native, and the Cincinnati baseball team is quite popular in this area. And here we have Mr. Rose breaking one of the major records in baseball history, that is the most hits, breaking the record of a legend, in his time anyway, Ty Cobb. So I think that is probably the major connection. I might also add that Rose indicates or presents a rather important image, I think, to kids, unlike the drug thing. And that Rose hasn't got great talent. I mean, relative to a lot of other Major League Baseball players in the history of baseball. You know, he's not as good a hitter as Cobb was. Cobb had a .367 lifetime batting average, and Rose only has a .305 lifetime average. He doesn't hit with power like a Roberto Clemente or a Willie Mays. He's not as fast. Doesn't steal bases like Lou Brock or Ricky Henderson. He's just been someone who's worked very hard. They call him Charlie Hustle over the years. And he represents kind of the Horatio Alger thing. You know, if you work hard enough in life, you can get ahead. And I think his record, this career record, is due to this individual just showing a lot of ability. And he's also presented a good image in trying to reach this record. You know, he hasn't been cocky. He's been fairly relaxed. So I think that is kind of an image that this area, as well as baseball, needs. But then again, on the other side, you've got the drug problem.
So in a sense, you're saying that here Pete Rose is a person who does not use drugs, but yet he is able to get the most out of his ability, and therefore he is a good illustration for kids in terms of trying to do their best.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Although Pete Rose's name came up in the drug trials, he was not in the cocaine scandal, but certainly as far as taking uppers, taking stimulants to help him as a ball player. So it's, you know, he's not untainted totally.
But that image certainly isn't coming across now, Larry. I mean, now it's the fact that he's this hardworking Charlie Hustle guy that's going to be breaking this record. That's the image which the media is presenting now of Rose. And also his teammate Dave Parker is going to be testifying as well. So it does touch Cincinnati. But I guess my basic point is here we've got this interesting contrast in baseball, and one of these major records is being broken. At the same time, we have important baseball players coming forth in these trials with immunity, by the way. That's probably why they're speaking so freely, you know, pointing out that there is indeed a drug problem in baseball.
So what do we want, Steve? Do we want to go back to the 50 years ago when we had the Ty Cobbs running the bases and the Babe Ruth hitting the home run, where we don't know anything about these people's private lives? Or are we, in fact, dealing with the very public lives of entertainers? It doesn't shock us when Richard Pryor has a drug problem or Stacy Keach has a drug problem. But God forbid you've got a different 22-year-old with time and money on his hands, and all of a sudden he's involved in a drug problem. I don't see the difference.
Well, that's a good point you make. I mean, years ago when Ty Cobb and Ruth were playing, they didn't present the best images as well. Ty Cobb was a very intense individual. He had a number of racial problems. He beat up black servants a couple of times, and also he had difficulty in other areas as well. And Ruth, of course, was a womanizer supposedly, and drank a lot, and was not the best image for baseball as well, or as back then. But the difference now is, I think, the media. There's so much media exposure that these guys are getting, and it does bring the problem to the fore. I suppose we need to know these things about these players. I'm just pointing out that indeed this is the case now. You know, the implications of it could be good and bad for baseball. And I guess my point is that we've got two images now that exist within baseball, the positive one and the negative one. Now what that might lead to is another question.
You know, I think there's been a lot of discussion about how the media has brought up the flaws of Major League Baseball players, actors, all kinds of people, in a way that they didn't in the 30s, and it's probably simply because there's more media exposure, there's television. There wasn't television in the 1930s. Perhaps the media is more, they hustle more on those kind of things. It makes better stories now than it did back then. But I'm really wondering whether or not we can really pin the blame on the media with respect to this loss of heroes that we've had in American culture. Is the reason we don't have any more heroes because we don't want any more heroes? That 30, 40, 50 years ago, heroes were really neat. They were the kind of thing we liked. Now the world's become more sophisticated, it's more complex, and heroes are very passé. I mean, they're considered to be silly, somebody that can fly over tall buildings and do wonderful things. We know that's not reality, and so we don't accept it anymore.
Well, I think that the image of a baseball player is as important today as it was 50 years ago when Cobb and Ruth and those ball players were on the field. I mean, even though things are more complex today, and we got more drugs and we got more possible sexual deviance and such, it's still important, I think, for a 9, 10, 11-year-old boy to have a nice image. And also, you've got the implication of here, this hero, and a lot of kids follow baseball. Here we've got these heroes that are people that are supposed to be examples for me using drugs. So that might give the child the idea that later on, hopefully later on, when they're at least not 8 and 9 years old, might have the idea that they too can use drugs. So it justifies drug use.
Role models are still important. I don't think anybody questions that. But are they as important as they were 50 years ago? Look at the movies 1935, Shirley Temple, A Childhood Star. Look at her level of sophistication. And then compare that to the level of sophistication of, say, the kids that played in E.T., where they know more of what's going on. They're much more sophisticated, much more worldly. Kids are used to these kinds of things. Maybe they don't.
Well, I would argue that probably a 7, 8-year-old, 9 person is not used to all this greater, you know, freedom with respect to sexual and drugs and those types of things. Maybe later on he becomes to realize that, but certainly a child about 7, 8, 9, a baseball player and his skill on the field is much more important than these more complex social problems.
Well, we don't need names of 7 years old or anyone else. We're out of time here today. Thanks to our panelists, Steve Johnson, Cecil Bohannon, and John Rouse for their commentary here today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47306. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborn. Public Affairs Roundtable is a production of the Department of Political Science and public radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.